Have the continents moved apart slowly over millions of years?
What was happening geologically during Noah's flood?
Today we're going to continue our discussion on Noah's flood on Creation Magazine Live. Welcome to Creation Magazine Live. I'm Calvin Smith.
And I'm Richard Fangrad. Creation Magazine Live is a program that summarizes the kind of information that you'll get in Creation Magazine.
Now, in the last episode, we were talking about Noah's flood, understanding the age of the earth, and we began to basically explore geology, asking questions like, how can we explain the origin of the world's geological features in relation to what we know is in the Bible about the flood? How would Christians explain the age of the earth, the geological features we see, and relate it to the age of the earth? Because, of course, this is a big bone of contention between creationists and evolutionists.
Right. The age of the earth issue is a controversial issue, and the age of the earth, it really comes from an interpretation of the geology.
Right.
Evolutionists believe that the rock layers were laid down slowly over millions of years. Obviously, as the title this episode suggests, we believe a flood is a better explanation for some of those things.
Right. And everyone needs to understand that when we're talking about this, of course, we're not talking about observed events.
That's right.
The millions of years history or the flood event, this is something we haven't observed, so we're taking this on faith. But now we have to look at the evidence and see, well, which model is better supported by the evidence?
Right. I mean, we take the Bible on faith that the history it records is accurate.
Right.
We talked in the last episode about James Hutton and the things that he took on faith. He believed the millions of years history, which he took on faith as well. And he began interpreting rocks and things like that, saying that everything that we observe, everything that we think about happened in the past, we have to use things that we observe happening today.
Right. His model actually excluded the Bible. Right off the bat, he just threw that out before he even formed his model. Right.
We introduced catastrophic plate tectonics, and we'll talk about that more on this program, that the continents have moved apart, and there's a lot of evidence for that.
So in this episode, we're going to continue talking about how a global flood provides a better explanation for the geological features.
Up until recently, conventional laws of aerodynamics could not explain how butterflies could fly at all, let alone maneuver so masterfully at low speeds. In the last decade, researchers have discovered that butterflies choose each wing stroke from an inventory of twists, flaps, claps, and flings. However, the flight control center in the brain of butterflies is very small, yet insects are more agile than aircraft equipped with computers. So how do insects exercise flight control over such a wide range of aerobatic abilities? It has been said that if engineers ever understand that, there will be a revolution in aeronautics.
Creation Ministries International staff, many from a wide variety of scientific disciplines, have produced thousands of articles now available in a massive online database. Creation.com has grown to become the world's most powerful internet resource on the creation evolution issue. There are more than 6,500 articles already online, and new articles are added daily. Some of the topics covered include the feasibility of Noah's Ark and evidence for a global flood, the age of the earth from both the Bible and science, scientific arguments against the Big Bang and models that explain observations in astronomy within a young Earth time frame, recent discoveries that support dinosaurs, fitting with biblical history, evidence from biology that shows that the type of change that is observed in living things has absolutely nothing to do with evolution, and many more topics. These thousands of articles are available for free 24 hours a day to anyone on Earth with an internet connection. Genesis is one of the most attacked areas of the Bible. Creation.com provides logical, scientifically accurate counterattacks in this area. As 2 Corinthians 10 verse 5 says, "We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God." Got questions? Get answers at creation.com.
Since Eve was formed out of a rib from Adam, some Christians have grown up believing that men have one less rib than women, which they don't. Some anti-creationists have used this to mock Genesis. But today, if someone loses their hand, it doesn't mean that their children will be born without hands. Interestingly, ribs are one of the few bones in the body that can grow back if removed, as long as the periosteum, the tissue around the bone, is left intact. So even Adam would have had the same number of ribs as everyone else.
Well, welcome back to Creation Magazine, and we're talking about Noah's Flood, Understanding the Age of the Earth, and this is part 2. So here's something we really need to explore then, because I think a lot of times when people are talking about Noah's Flood, they don't really get maybe an idea of the cataclysm that was Noah's Flood. I mean, if the Bible's true, if there was a massive global flood that covered the entire earth, a cataclysm, what exactly would that do?
What would it do? What kind of damage would it do? We know that in small floods, there's a lot of moving water has tremendous power to
erosive properties,
rip things up and redeposit sediment.
Right.
Let's have a look. Let's just have a look at some of the things on Mars. Let's start with Mars first of all.
It might be a funny place to start.
Here. It's a funny place to start, but we'll get to Earth in just a second. Here's a picture of Mars. This is obviously taken from satellites, spacecraft that have been sent to Mars. Look at some of the geologic features on Mars. This is obviously from a very high altitude. There's a ridge there. It certainly looks like water erosion, doesn't it? There on Mars. Here's another cliff, and it's again water erosion. You can see there many different cliffs there on Mars. Again, all taken from very high altitude from spacecraft that have circled the planets.
Believe these are water erosive features?
Well, we're getting there actually. Okay. That's the big punchline here that I was going to sneak up on, but
I blew it.
If we go back to the planetary shot of Mars here, look at in the center of the picture. You see this massive scar on Mars here. We pointed out with this arrow here, and you can see this. This is a massive canyon.
Right.
And here's a little closer view of it. There's its name there. It's about 4,000 kilometers long. The width varies from about 50 to 100 kilometers, 600 kilometers at its maximum width.
Right.
And its depth is about 10 kilometers deep. That's 6 to 7 times deeper than the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon at its widest is about 18 miles.
Okay.
I don't know what that is in kilometers, but it's not 600 kilometers, right? This is a huge, huge canyon.
So this is bigger than Grand Canyon.
This is way bigger than Grand Canyon.
Wow.
What's ironic is that astronomers who are looking at Mars, when these pictures came back, they said these canyons and these features that we just looked at on Mars, it looks like it was carved by water.
Okay.
It was really interesting. There's no liquid water on Mars that we know of.
We found some ice crystals and stuff like that, but
here's a picture of one of the polar ice caps. There's what appears to be ice there.
Right.
And it's just interesting thinking of Mars and this canyon that we see there on Mars. A number of years ago in Creation Magazine, there was an article written about these pictures that they came back from the spacecraft, and here's what scientists were saying about fountains of the Great Deep on Mars. What does fountains of the Great Deep sound like?
Sounds like Genesis.
Here's the article. This is in the Focus section in Creation Magazine. Creationists have often noted a certain irony in the beliefs of many geologists about Mars. On a planet, Earth, which is largely covered with water, they deny that there ever could have been a global flood, yet the majority believe that on Mars, a planet on which we have yet to detect any liquid water, many of its surface features were formed by massive global or near global flooding. Michael Carr of the U.S. Geological Survey estimated that the amount of water needed to carve the Martian flood channels was, quote, the equivalent of a layer of water several tens of meters deep covering the entire surface of the planet, end quote.
So they have no problem believing in a global flood on Mars. But there's no water on Mars that we found.
There's no water on Mars. You look at Earth.
Simply observing the features on Mars from we've never been there, but simply looking at them would lead you to the conclusion
these features have been eroded by water.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, you look at Earth, and there's a picture of a globe.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a certain part of the globe that shows mostly water.
It's the side that we usually don't look at.
It's the side that we usually don't look at.
Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Then here's another picture of a canyon. This is, again, a satellite picture of a canyon. We can zoom in on some of the detail there of that canyon. Looks like the canyons we just looked at on Mars. Mm-hmm. These are satellite pictures of course, the Grand Canyon here on Earth in Arizona.
Wow. But the conclusion that most geologists on this Earth say is the Grand Canyon was cut by a little bit of water over a long period of time.
Yes, not a global flood. But you can have a global flood on Mars to explain the massive canyons there.
But we haven't been there, and there's no liquid water on Mars.
Well, that's inconsistency, right? That's the kind of thing we were looking at. So, yes, a global flood could do a lot of canyon cutting, and it's admitted that it could do that on Mars, but not on Earth. Anyways, a flood could do that even on Earth.
Where do cavemen fit into biblical history? Based on their evolutionary beliefs, most cavemen were primitive brutes on the way to becoming fully human. From the viewpoint of biblical history, after the confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel as people spread out, they would have lived in a variety of homes made of mud, stone, wood, tents, or in caves. The Bible describes a number of cavemen. In Genesis, we find that Lot was once a caveman after he fled Sodom. When David ran from King Saul, he lived in a cave, and Job mentions people who lived in caves also. Thus, you would expect evidence all over the world that skillful, talented, and fully human people have lived in caves at various times.
In the last episode, we introduced catastrophic plate tectonics, the idea that the continents broke apart rapidly during the flood.
Right.
So let's unpackage that a little bit. Let's just talk about that idea a little bit more. The way it began was creationists, scientists just began recognizing that there's a gravitational instability between the ocean plates, we're talking about the pre-flood ocean plates, and to some extent, same thing today. The pre-flood ocean plates are heavier than the material that they're sitting on, heavier than the mantle. It's gravitationally unstable. The heavier stuff should be on the bottom, right? It's gravitationally unstable. The thought that creationists had was, what if those pre-flood ocean plates began to sink, began to subduct?
Right.
Would it lead to a runaway event? Would they go faster and faster and faster and faster, recycling all of the pre-flood ocean floor into the Earth? Gravity wants to pull it into the Earth. It's unstable to begin with. And on the other side of the world, breaking apart the original supercontinent, Pangaea, which was always kind of a creationist idea, but the evolutionists have hijacked that of late and applied their millions of years to it.
Because you read in Genesis how all the waters were gathered together in one place, which leads to the conclusion that all the landmass must have been in one place too. That was written in Genesis long before.
There's plenty of evidence that the continents have moved apart. So the question that we need to ask is, what's the mechanism for breaking those apart, and when?
Right. When? Because I've got the question before in Q&A time. There's a verse about in the days of Peleg. The
Earth was divided. Right? That's
what
his name is supposed to mean. That's Genesis 10:25.
Right.
Could this event, catastrophic plate tectonics, have happened at the day in the time of Peleg?
Right.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
This is so catastrophic, as we'll see in the rest of the program today. It's so catastrophic that had people been living, they would have been killed. That's how catastrophic it is.
And Peleg, of course, is after.
It's the Tower of Babel. It's after the flood.
After the flood, right. So this is what you're saying is that if you had a flood and catastrophic plate tectonics happening at the time of Peleg, it'd be another huge catastrophe
during the flood. But what about that? What about that verse then? Genesis 10:25. If you look at Genesis 11:1, the same language is used there. Now the earth, Eretz in Hebrew, had one language. That's the same word that's used in Genesis 10:25 because the earth would be divided. It doesn't mean a division of the physical earth. It means the people of the earth were divided by language, just like it's used in Genesis 11.
The whole earth, the earth isn't talking, but it's talking about the people of the earth.
That's what it's referring to. That's when the Tower of Babel happened in the days of Peleg. That's a much better way to understand that. So there's some questions that the model needs to answer. We've got this model. We're trying to come up with how this could happen. during the flood and so on, there's some questions. We're beginning to construct a scientific model to explain geologic features within the context of biblical history.
And even the flood mechanism itself.
What caused the flood? How did the continents flood, and so on? But here are some major questions. How can the pre-flood ocean plates, which are obviously made of rock, slide quickly through the Earth's mantle, which is also made of rock? Right. Now, the mantle of the Earth is not molten rock. Much of it is at about 80% of its melting temperature, but it's still solid rock. So that's a legitimate question that needs to be overcome. How do you slide rock through rock? In other words, can the friction be overcome? That's the real question here. That was a concern. The model needs to explain that. Second question, what mechanism could move the continents apart so quickly during the year-long flood?
Because evolutionists believe plate tectonics occur.
Yes.
But they believe they happen very, very slowly.
Slowly, yeah. Centimeters per year.
It's always millions of years, so that has to be explained within that model.
Yeah, and so we're looking at something that does it faster than that. During the year-long flood, a little over a year, Noah was on board the ark. So that we need to understand that. Dr. John Baumgartner was one of the main scientists involved with this, and he developed a computer model that was run on a Cray supercomputer, all the computations, very, very complex. And here are some outputs from the Cray supercomputer. This is, I'll explain these to you here in the upper rectangle there. You see the one that's mostly yellow. The blue material is cool material at the surface. Those are the ocean plates. The red material, the red areas at the bottom are hot material near the core that's rising up to the top. And the viscosity is recorded on the lower of the two graphs there. Right. Now this is a little bit later in the process. You can see that a lot of cool material has made its way down toward the core, and other places hot material has come up to replace it. And then you have the end of the process here where just about all the cool material is gone, and you've you know,
we're running out of time here, and this is very interesting. So why don't we take a short break, come back and explain this in detail, because this is neat stuff.
When Dr. Carl Whelan started Creation Magazine in his home in 1978, little did he realize that today it would reach into some 170 countries all around the world and have such a huge impact in so many lives. This unique 56-page full-color family magazine refutes evolution and gives God the glory for the amazing creation we see around us. Creation Magazine is an essential tool for anyone wanting to immunize their family against the anti-biblical worldviews bombarding us from all sides. With no paid advertising, every page in Creation Magazine is chock full of powerful articles, ammunition to intelligently discuss nature, history, science, the Bible, and related subjects. Although written for lay people, every effort is made to ensure the content is technically accurate so that even experts are satisfied. And young children look forward to the section written especially for them. Many have come to faith in Christ because of subscribers sharing this magazine with them. So subscribing not only boosts your faith, it enables you to get biblical truth into your community in a special way. Subscribe today and have it delivered to your home every 3 months. Visit creation.com for subscription information or call the CMI office nearest you.
So let's continue talking about plate tectonics and this two-dimensional model on the Cray supercomputer. You can see here the graphs there. We just talked about that before the break. Here's a bit of an animation that you can see this process happening. These are the outputs from the supercomputer laid one on top of the other. Keep your eye on the velocity up there in meters per second in the upper left. It repeats several times. You can see it go up to 7 meters per second of movement in the mantle, and the viscosity down there in the lower graph is just all over the map. You can see that repeating there several times. So the answer to these questions, can this process happen rapidly? Right. Can the friction be overcome? Was yes, this can absolutely happen. Right. From this most advanced computer modeling and some of the cutting-edge scientific research that we have today.
And Dr. John Baumgartner is well respected.
He's considered by his peers to be the world's leading plate tectonic modeler. Right. And he is a young Earth, Bible-believing, six-day creationist.
Right.
And he's
well respected in the scientific community at large.
Yes, yes. What are the consequences of this process? What happens when you start moving continents around at these speeds? 7 meters per second is about 25 kilometers per hour. what happens when you move continents around at those kinds of speeds.
Right.
Well, let's think of some of those. New ocean floor. The continent rips apart, new ocean floor comes up. That's red hot material. Any seawater that splashes onto that area flashes to steam. Imagine along the mid-Atlantic ridge where new ocean floor was produced. No Atlantic Ocean before the flood.
Right.
Seawater splashing onto that area, vaporizing to steam. It would then fall, obviously, as rain.
Right.
What goes up must come down.
Yeah.
The calculations for how much rainfall that can produce suggest something like worldwide rainfall at a rate of 3 feet an hour.
So here again, if you look at a globe, you can see this mid-Atlantic ridge. You can see this underwater, it looks like a rip right down the center of the Atlantic.
Yes.
And of course, the Bible talks about 40 days and 40 nights of rain. So here your model is explaining, again, what we see written in
Intense
Scripture.
rain
Right.
at the onset of the flood. And then there's the ocean floor, that hot new ocean floor. It's composed of mantle material and so on, but it's hot, so it's less dense, it's lighter. It floats higher on the mantle. So now the new ocean floor is higher than the old ocean floor, which is being pulled by gravity into the earth.
Right.
The friction is overcome. What happens there with the friction is it generates heat, which melts some of the rock, which acts as a lubricant.
Right.
It's almost like oiling a wheel, squeaky wheel or something, and it moves faster and faster. And so the process happens. This new ocean floor is about a mile higher than the old ocean floor. So what happens to the water that's in the oceans? It goes out over the land.
Right.
Then some work has been done on what would the ocean currents look like. Here's a picture of what the currents would look like with no continents. So you've got strong currents now circulating over the submerged continents. That's going to produce things like we observe in Grand Canyon. The layers that we see there cover a huge area, and we talked about this on the last program. So that's going to explain that kind of geologic feature.
Right. Like deposition over a huge,
massive
huge area.
deposition.
Right.
The continents are submerged. Then in Grand Canyon as well, you've got these contacts. For example, you see here between the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Shale, flat and smooth. You can trace it throughout if you're rafting down the river.
Right.
However, evolutionists suggest that there's 10 million years of missing time at that location. that surface was exposed to the air for 10 million years.
So because the absence of the evidence, then you just stick the millions of years in between there.
Well, I mean, if it was really exposed to the atmosphere for that long, you'd expect both physical and chemical erosion.
Right.
Erosion. Physical erosion, it shouldn't be flat. Rain and that would erode.
It wouldn't be uniform. It wouldn't be razor sharp like that.
No.
Right.
And also chemical erosion, right? It's exposed to the atmosphere, to oxygen. That's going to change the chemical structure of the upper layers of the Hermit Shale.
But not uniformly, not like that. Not in a perfect straight line, right?
Yes. And then other things we can think of as well is the current spread a sediment. Most living things die. They're preserved as fossils, rapid burial, that type of thing. The stirring in the mantle that we can see in this picture here, you see the vectors and so on. As the plates sink, there's a stirring that's set up in the mantle. That's the mechanism that on the surface moves the continents around. Right. So you've got a stirring of the rock in the mantle. That was one of the questions that the model needed to answer.
Right.
Now, once all of the heavy pre-flood ocean floor is gone, and that might be at this stage here, you can see in this picture here, much of it is gone.
Right.
The process rapidly shuts down, and now the ocean floor begins to sink, and you have a period of erosion that happens. And so we have evidence of that as well. Massive erosion that this model explains.
Young Earth creationists are sometimes accused of believing that the whole Bible should be taken literally. What we actually encourage is that the biblical text should be taken according to the style of writing, that is, taken straightforwardly. The Bible contains poetry, parables, prophecy, apocalyptical writing, and historical narrative. Each writing style should be taken as it is written. For example, we should not twist the parables of Jesus to suggest that they refer to real people or events. Since Genesis was clearly written as historical narrative, to understand it straightforwardly means taking it as a literal historical record of what actually happened.
All right, well, there's so much to talk about, what happened in the flood and so on. We're running out of time here with some of these things. We just ended off saying toward the end of the flood, toward the end of this process, the ocean plates begin to get heavier and sink lower into the mantle. That means the water rushes from the continents. Right. And now toward the end of the flood, you have a period of erosion. And you see massive amounts of erosion here in the Grand Canyon area. You can trace the rim further to the north, the sediments at the rim of the canyon, and there's a massive amount that has been eroded in the past. This process is going to explain that erosion. If you have a huge amount of water moving at a uniform speed, you have what's called sheet erosion. It erodes in flat sheets. You get canyon cutting when the depth decreases, and then you get channeling and so on. But this process is going to explain things like that.
Well, catastrophic plate tectonics is a fairly newer model for creationists. It seems to have great explanatory power because we're talking about things like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and the fact that it does seem like the continents all seem to there, and it would explain rain, all these things. But is there evidence that this happened recently, not over millions of years? Because I think a lot of evolutionists would kind of agree with some of the things, but while it happened over millions of years, what's the evidence for?
There was measurements made of the temperature of the rock down near the core years ago. And when the data came back, geologists were astonished. They discovered that near the core, there's huge areas of cool rock. And they thought, what are those? If those are the plates that have been subducting slowly and gradually for millions of years, they should already have heated up to the temperature down around the core.
Now, when you say cool, you're saying it's much cooler than
they expect.
Right. Yes. I don't think I want to be down there. But
the rock hasn't yet had time to heat up to the temperature down around the core.
Right.
And that actually could explain the magnetic reversals that we talked about in the last program that you see there along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. How did those come about? If you cool down the area around the core, you're going to increase convection in the liquid iron core. It's solid iron at the very center, but liquid iron, and it's thought that that would cause the magnetic field to flip back and forth, and that pattern was then recorded.
So if you were confused about that on the last show, maybe this
you're more confused now. We're summarizing this information. It's a summary, right?
Yeah.
There's another evidence that had happened recently, and that's not so much having to do with Earth. The Magellan spacecraft was sent to Venus in the early 90s, and it brought back pictures of the surface of Venus. We could look through the intense clouds on Venus for the first time, and when the data came back, we saw things like this, this picture here. And this is a basalt plain, a massive plain of basalt, of formerly molten rock.
Right.
And here's an impact crater, an asteroid came in there, something came in there. The thing that astonished the astronomers was how come the surface of Venus looks so new? It looks so fresh. Where's the erosion?
Like there's some impact craters.
But the ejecta blankets, the things that are thrown out of the crater, where's all the erosion? These things are supposed to be millions of years old. Astronomers are thinking now that it looks like the entire surface of Venus has been recycled via this same process. A rapid, recent recycling of the surface of Venus.
So secular scientists are saying that this process could have happened on Venus. It would explain what they're observing.
Yeah.
So again, you've got one of these cases where, well, secular scientists might deny catastrophic plate tectonics. It's a creationist model
on Earth.
They deny a global flood. It's a creationist model on Earth, but it's okay to happen on Mars and Venus.
Right.
Okay. Just wanted
to clarify that. Of course, the next step with this model, we showed you the two-dimensional outputs from Dr. John Baumgartner from his model. The next step was developing a three-dimensional model. Obviously, the Earth is a three-dimensional entity. Dr. Baumgartner broke up a sphere representing the Earth into 1.3, 1.4 million little cells that all the conservation of energy equations that go into each of these cells that monitor the movement of this process and so on. Now here are the outputs from the three-dimensional computer model on the supercomputer. You can see the original supercontinent there. If you can zoom in on that picture, if you're watching this via iPod or something like that, you can see the vectors and the relative speed and strength and so on. And here's kind of a cross-section. We're not interested in the core, that's why it's white there, but you can see in many places, in a couple of places there, cold material is being pulled toward the core.
Right.
In other places, hot material is coming up to replace that. There's a little bit later in the process, and here again a shot from space.
Now, this would explain, too, how when we see these huge mountain ranges where continents have smashed together.
Yes, exactly.
That couldn't have happened if the plates were moving very, very slowly. That would be better explained by catastrophic plate tectonics.
Smash them together at high speed.
Very, very quickly.
Yes.
Many people think the Earth is billions of years old, but have you ever wondered exactly how scientists date rocks? In his video, Rocks and Ages, Do They Hide Millions of Years?, Dr. Emil Silvestru explains the assumptions that govern what geologists pretend to see in the rock record. A biblical model based on the cataclysmic flood makes much more sense of the rocks we find today. Emil Silvestru investigates geological anomalies that secular scientists avoid because they conflict with the idea of evolution. Imagine a tree fossilized in layers of rock that should have been separated by millions of years, yet the tree stayed intact. And what about fossilized pollen found in rocks that, according to evolutionary timelines, predate this type of complex life form? Dr. Silvestru explains evidences and shows how they support the Bible's teaching of a young Earth.
Okay, it's in the news time.
Yes.
And I'm just going to go directly to Creation Magazine here, because often in Creation Magazine, of course, we comment on news stories that have come out, and our writers will comment on it. So I'm just going to read the article. It's called Mars Too Salty to Support Life. And this is based on an ABC News article. We're sending up the rovers there to Mars, and we're taking a look around, and we're taking shots, and so
right.
Let's just read this, and then talk about some of the presuppositions maybe. No liquid water has ever been found on Mars. But over the last 2 years, observations from NASA spacecraft orbiting Mars and from 2 robotic rovers on the surface have convinced many scientists that water, a key condition for the survival of life, once flowed on the surface of Mars. However, new data from one of the surface rovers indicates that the planet was far too salty, researchers say. Microbes could not have survived in such salty and highly acidic waters. Okay, so we're commenting on a news story. Mars, it's too salty to support life. It's interesting that these types of news articles come out all the time. The origin of life scenario. Oh, we're looking for life in the universe. We're looking for this. What's the underlying assumption?
Evolution.
Evolution. The biblical history, that's not true. I think sometimes Christians miss that when they just, and they start down these evolutionary paths. That's all based on a presumption. I mean, God has been totally removed from the equation of what they're doing here. Right? Why would you be looking for life on other planets? Well, if life evolved on Earth, it must have evolved in other places. Maybe we can go find evidence for that.
Thinking behind it.
And there's billions of dollars being poured into programs over the years looking for origin of life scenarios when we already have the best origin of life scenario.
Yes, yeah. So that's, again, just short little articles in Creation Magazine that just keep Christians informed on what's going on in this issue, just to provide clarity and so on. We've got another one here. Newly discovered stars shouldn't exist. Newly discovered stars shouldn't exist. It seems as though every time astronomers point their telescopes at the night sky, some weird new finding forces them to revamp their theories. So began an article in Science Now reporting the recent discovery of 9 white dwarf stars that went on to say, and this again right from the article, the stars defy their expected chemical makeup and by rights shouldn't even exist. End quote. That's because the newly discovered stars are different from other white dwarfs in a number of characteristics, including having atmospheres made entirely of carbon with no traces of hydrogen or helium. Patrick Dufour of the University of Arizona said that the unexpectedly unique chemical signature of the stars tells us, this quote, tells us that nature has found a way that we didn't know how to make white dwarf stars without using hydrogen or helium surface layers.
Good old nature.
End quote. Astronomer Klaus Werner of Germany's Institute for Astronomy and Astrophysics agreed. And he's quoted as saying, there is currently no explanation for how such stars can be formed, he said. It's a real challenge to stellar evolution theory.
Right.
So here's another thing that I think most people are probably familiar with. Oh, stars evolve from dust in the universe. The dust comes together and these stars evolve and so on. And here's some stars that science can't explain.
Right. And the point we're always making is you may go to school and you may learn something as fact, and then, if you keep up to date on the material 10 years later, oh, well, we've overturned that evidence, and now and of course, creationists do that too. We were just talking about a model, but, things change.
They learn it as fact, but what they're actually learning is an interpretation of the facts.
Exactly.
Right? And we try to make that clear on this program, in Creation Magazine, and everything that Creation Ministries produces.
Right.
It's an interpretation of facts that's being promoted in the school system and the media.
Right.
Let's do one more, again out of Creation Magazine. This is the Burgess Shale timescale. It happened in a rush. The Burgess Shale is one of those icons of evolution.
Right.
Out in Western Canada. Here's the article. The Burgess Shale in the Canadian Rockies is famous for its layers upon layers of magnificently preserved creatures. Even soft tissue has been preserved in remarkable detail. This was explained as being due to anoxic conditions. Anoxic, I think. I should have figured out how to pronounce that. In other words, lacking oxygen. That's what it means in non-technical terms. In an atmosphere lacking oxygen on the bottom of the supposed tranquil lagoon where the animals lay. These conditions are said to have prevented them from rotting away while they were slowly covered by fine sediment layer by layer, and preserving the eons of time over which evolution unfolded. According to a report published in the Journal of the Geological Society, this iconic story is wrong. The laminated shale did not settle from a tranquil lagoon, but was deposited quickly from a thick slurry that avalanched down a steep slope and blasted across the ocean floor. Evolution is running out of time. Catastrophic deposition means the rocks were formed quickly, so where can they find all those millions of years?
Right.
And this article was in, as was mentioned, the Journal of the Geological Society.
Right. So another example of where people might have, you might have been studying geology a certain number of years ago, and oh, this is proof. We know that this got laid down slowly over millions of years, and oh, look, we've got new information or maybe new technology that can give us new information, and
it's just interesting how science moves on. We learn more things. Now, even as we just read, secular scientists are reinterpreting the Burgess Shale as rapid deposition, rapidly deposited. That's why the animals were preserved so well, because they were rapidly buried. No need to suppose some type of an oxygen-free environment that prevented them from decaying. They were buried rapidly.
Right.
That's why they were preserved so well.
I think I heard Dr. Silvestri, one of our speakers in Canada here, explain Creation Magazine and why it's so important. I mean, obviously, this is a magazine that our ministry produces, so I'm plugging
it's kind of our flagship publication, isn't it?
Yeah. And people say, well, why are you guys promoting this? Why are we doing this TV show? Well, it's to give people information like this. Because as Emil said one time, he said, Christians often are kind of lagging behind, getting up to speed in information like this. And so, he described it as it's kind of like National Geographic. Many people subscribe to National Geographic. They're getting this information update all the time, right? And it's brand new and it's current, et cetera, et cetera. But it's all interpreted through an evolutionary paradigm. You get Creation Magazine, all of a sudden you have all this current information and you're up to date, but through a biblical worldview. It's kind of like we're all on the same boat, we're all on the same team, we're all on the same speed, and so Christians can have a ready response. I mean, a ready defense. Isn't that what apologetics is?
Yes, and I mean, the Creation Magazine had such an impact on my life. I mean, I subscribed. When did I subscribe now? 94. By 95, I started getting involved in the local creation ministry, which eventually became part of this international group, which is now called CMI.
And now you're...
But it was the magazine that did that.
Right.
By reading the magazine, I could see that, hey, there are answers for our faith.
Right.
We can be scientifically literate and not have to abandon the Bible, and particularly Genesis. And it's just so exciting to be involved in a ministry that is building up the church and building up people in their faith.
Many people have seen a depiction of Noah's Ark that looks like a big cartoon boat with animals bulging from its hull and giraffes sticking out of the top. Depicted like that, it seems more like a fairy tale than a real historical event. According to the description in Genesis 6, the ark measured around 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high, so its volume was about 1.5 million cubic feet. This is the equivalent volume of over 500 railroad stock cars, each of which can hold 240 sheep. Calculations suggest that the average size of the animals on the ark was about the size of a sheep, and that 16,000 or less were needed to repopulate the species after the flood. The ark was well designed for its intended purpose.
Thousands, not billions. Radioisotope dating is one of the linchpins of evolutionary education today. This dating method is used by evolutionists to cast doubt on the reliability of the Bible and its chronology of Earth history. In the book, Thousands Not Billions, Dr. Don DeYoung summarizes the results of an 8-year creationist research initiative devoted specifically to investigate radioisotope dating. Groundbreaking original research results are explained at a layman's level. Evolutionists seek to undermine faith in Genesis as the true record of history of the universe. When people are told that a dinosaur bone has been determined to be tens of millions of years old by radioisotope dating, that obviously doesn't fit with the biblical record of the land animals and man being created on day 6 of creation. This book demonstrates that Christians no longer have to puzzle over this glaring contradiction and is highly recommended for anyone trying to harmonize modern science with the biblical record.
Now, one of the consequences of a global flood, of catastrophic plate tectonics, is what happens immediately after the flood.
Right.
And we haven't talked about this on any of the episodes yet in a previous episode. An ice age. Was there an ice age? If so, when? Well, yes, there was an ice age.
This is one of the most asked questions I get in churches.
Well, here in
what
Canada,
about an ice age?
we're in the ice age 6 months of the year anyway. So.
Maybe that's what it is.
So let's explain the ice age. It is another consequence of a global flood. You need 3 conditions on the surface of the Earth in order to get an ice age. You need more evaporation, more snowfall, and cooler summers. Mm-hmm. Those 3. If you can get those 3 conditions on the surface of the Earth, you'll generate an ice age.
Right.
So how does a flood do that? More evaporation. Let's start with the first one. If this process happened, the breakup of the supercontinent and so on, you've got a lot of friction, a lot of heat generated and so on.
Fountains of the Great Deep bursting open.
Fountains of the Great Deep, that type of thing. The ocean water after the flood is going to be a lot warmer than it is today. Right. Warmer water evaporates quicker. That's why your hair dryers blow hot air instead of cold air, right? That's the first condition met. Then again, as a result of the flood, so the other 2 are more snowfall and cooler summers. So how do you get those? Again, as a result of the flood and this process, earth movements and so on, you've got volcanism, volcanoes, spewing, tons and tons of dust into the atmosphere, shielding out the sun's radiation, which makes for cooler continents, and the other 2 conditions met.
And that's observable. When Mount St. Helens blew up in 1980, we were getting cloud cover in southern Ontario. Like, we were getting the effects.
Well, the really big volcanoes that erupt even today, they affect weather sometimes on a global scale if they're big enough. So the flood, lots of volcanoes, lots of problems. So the ice age probably began immediately after the flood. You've got the oceans pumping moisture into the atmosphere. Right. Once it gets over the continents, not a lot of sunlight, not a lot of heat, it's going to fall as snow, and you're going to have the north and the polar ice caps grow, and then at the end of the ice age shrink back. So the ice age lasting about 700 years, beginning immediately after the flood, peaking at maybe 500 years, something like that.
Now, 2 things I like to point out because people sometimes confuse. Number one, when we're talking about an ice age, we're not talking about the Earth covered in ice.
Right, that's a common
people like, what? They think of some movie they saw or something, but it just grows to a certain extent and then retreats.
Right, the glaciers covered this part of Canada at one point in history, kilometers thick ice sheets we're talking about here, and they went down into the States some distance, but Mexico has never seen a glacier.
Right, and the other thing is when you say immediately following the flood, you don't mean that it would have taken time for the ice to build up. So it started immediately falling, but you wouldn't have ice until several hundred years later that would be coming down, just so people understand, because those are questions that I get.
Well, another question that we get, which is related to the ice age and the flood and where Noah landed after the flood, is how do you get animals from the Middle East where the Ark landed? It says the Ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. That's a mountain chain. How do they get from there to places like Australia, for example? Today is an island.
Right.
How do you, if the Ark landed there with all the animals, how does that happen?
Right. You can't get there today by walking.
Right. One of the answers that our folks will give and that you'll see on the website and in Creation Magazine is, at the time of the Ice Age, you're going to be pulling huge amounts of water out of the ocean, dumping it on land in these kilometers thick ice sheets. Today, if you lower the ocean levels by about 200 feet, all the continents, including Australia, are connected by land.
Right.
So the question of how did the kangaroo and
you can literally walk across.
He could have hopped there.
Right.
Probably. And here's some other possibilities. People knew how to build boats.
Of course.
Maybe at the time of the Tower of Babel, some people moving away from Babel couldn't speak the same language anywhere. Maybe they built some boats and sailed across the newly formed Atlantic Ocean to become the Incas and Aztecs in South America.
Mm-hmm.
That's a possibility.
And there's ample evidence for an ice age, right? We've got rocks that have been scraped across each other, and till deposits and moraines.
Lots
so
of evidence
it's not like
one ice age.
Yes. We interpret it as one rather than several over millions of years or something like that. And I find it interesting that the book of Job in the Bible chronologically takes place right after the flood.
Very old book in the Bible.
Yes. And it's interesting how this is the first time ice is really mentioned in the Bible. God asked Job, where did the wombs of ice come from? Interesting.
It mentions ice and snow and winter storms and that kind of thing.
The wombs of ice, you can picture the glaciers, growing, and then that would be very unusual.
Yes.
So it takes place right there in the Bible. Again, catastrophic plate tectonics having great explanatory power in many different areas of geology. That's right.
The Apostle Peter made apologetics a requirement for all Christians when he wrote to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Christian apologetics involves both giving a reasoned defense of the Christian faith against objections and setting forth positive grounds for Christianity. In the origins debate, there is both powerful evidence against evolution and strong scientific support for the accuracy of the Genesis account of creation. Find out more at creationontheweb.org.
Okay, so we're talking about catastrophic plate tectonics, a great model for flood geology and to back up what the Scripture actually says, right? Because we hold the authority of the Bible first, and then we're looking for models to be able to explain that. Now, I get asked about a model that creationists promoted for a while there, years ago, the vapor canopy model.
And now we're going to pull the rug out from under the...
I know. This has happened to me.
But we need to do this. We need to do this.
Right.
The vapor canopy model it's like catastrophic plate tectonics. It was an attempt to explain phenomena that we read about in the Bible or to explain things that we're observing today using a scientific explanation.
Right. And I've had people, when I talk about catastrophic plate tectonics and things like that, because it seems to be a superior model to the vapor canopy. We're going to talk about that in a second. But they're like, well, what about that one? They went to a creation meeting in the 80s or something like that, or they saw a videotape,
yes.
and they're like, what are you guys doing? You're taking away my evidence, or and they're almost like, because, that was the way. And they don't really understand the way the science works and perhaps the way creation ministry really operates. We say the Bible is authoritative. What it says occurred, but we don't know the scientific way, because it happened in the past. We're just like evolutionists. We have to come up with scientific models. And that doesn't seem to have good explanatory power anymore for certain reasons.
Let's just explain some of the things that the vapor canopy was supposed to explain. It was supposed to account for the 40 days and 40 nights of intense rain.
Right.
This canopy of water vapor, not liquid, vapor water was precipitated. It accounted for the rain. It was supposed to account for a worldwide greenhouse effect.
Right.
Tropical, nice to live areas.
Right, because we know the environment was nicer before the flood.
To be that way from the fossils and so on. It was supposed to explain how people could live that long, to almost 1,000 years.
Right.
Now, there are scientific and biblical problems with it, and the model, we don't really need the model to explain those things anymore anyway. Let's just go through some of them.
Right.
Firstly, the scientific problems. Dr. Larry Vardaman at the Institute for Creation Research, he's an atmospheric scientist. He looked at, did some computer modeling on what the temperature would be under this vapor canopy. And he discovered that it would produce such a powerful greenhouse effect that the temperature at the surface of the Earth would be way above the boiling point.
It'd fry us.
It would vaporize the oceans and life would be impossible. So
right.
He's tried all kinds of things to correct that, but to no avail.
Right.
So there's some scientific problems. What are the biblical problems? Well, the Bible says that God separated the waters from the waters, and in between there was the expanse. Right. The waters below the expanse, or the firmament in the King James, seem to be the oceans.
Right.
What is the waters above? The waters above, could that be the vapor canopy?
This was actually the reason I believe people started adopting this.
Yes.
I believe the text drove them to that conclusion.
Well, you've got the waters above, and on day 5, God places the flying creatures into that expanse. So the waters above the expanse could be the waters in the atmosphere. But then on day 4, God places into that same expanse, same word, the sun, moon, and stars.
Right.
So what is the location of the waters above the expanse? somewhere out in space, right?
Right.
There's biblical problems. In addition to that, King David writes, long after the flood, in the Psalms, praise him ye heavens, praise him ye waters above the heavens. The waters above the heavens were still in place at the time of King David.
Right.
For all we know, they're still in place today.
And to be honest, for me, that's the biggest problem with the water canopy theory, is the biblical refutation
and that should
of it.
be our perspective as Christians.
Because right there, and maybe Christians, Bible-believing Christians, maybe they just hadn't noticed those verses yet. That's powerful evidence that you should throw that model out, because the Scripture actually goes against it.
Another reason is that it's not needed anymore. It was supposed to explain how people could live so long, but by changing the environment, you're not going to get people to live to 1,000 years. It's genetic.
Right.
There's things on the ends of our genes that control how many times they can replicate themselves, and there's other information.
Yeah.
Catastrophic plate tectonics is the best model that we currently have, but it does not explain everything.
Right.
It's a very robust model, but there could be data that we discover tomorrow that invalidates that model to the point where we have to come up with something entirely new. So we could ask the question, so why bother with these models?
Right. That's a legitimate question. People are going to say, well, if you're going to just change things, I mean, why am I going to teach my kids one thing one day, and then you guys are going to come along and say, hey, we got a new model. What's the purpose?
Right. And the answer to that really is to have an answer for skeptics.
Right.
We want to show that we have a way of explaining, within a biblical framework, the geology that we see, Grand Canyon, rock layers, rapidly buried fossils, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the fit of the continents, and so on. We have an explanation for those things.
Right.
From science that can explain these things, but ultimately we want to build up the church so that Christians can have answers for these things and stand in front of the skeptics with answers for their faith, so that they don't leave the faith ultimately. Exactly. And that's why we do what we do.
Creation.com is the world's most powerful internet resource for finding answers to questions about the origins debate. Creation or evolution? When the results are in, which one is supported by scientific observations? Find out at Creation.com. Creation scientists and researchers from around the world have contributed more than 6,500 articles, many of which appeared in leading creationist publications like Creation Magazine and the Journal of Creation, over more than 30 years. When news breaks about the latest evolutionary ape man, or some major supposed evidence for evolution, check out Creation.com for a Christian creationist response. Each weekend, the website features a feedback article, response to a web visitor's email feedback. Often, the anti-creation arguments in skeptics' emails are refuted in a detailed response by a CMI staff member. So in a very practical way, believers can see that the Bible, and particularly Genesis, can be defended against the skeptics' arguments. The website includes an online store where you can browse through hundreds of the world's leading creationist books, DVDs, and related materials. Got questions? Get answers at Creation.com.
Well, it's the feedback section of our program here.
I like the feedback section.
I like the feedback section. I look forward to Fridays, seriously, on our website, and I go check it, because it's really great, and I think it's great for Christians to see skeptics pose questions to our scientists. Some of them there's some highly educated people pose questions to our scientists, scientists and stuff. Sometimes they're just lay persons. And then to see our experts in different fields answer them intelligently, according to the biblical model, etc.
Yes.
I think it's a great,
we should mention that is Friday. If you look back at the archives of the front page articles that change 6 times a week, go to the Friday feedbacks. So they're actually archived. There's a feedback section where you can look at them all there, all the Friday feedbacks.
Creationontheweb.org. You can get a lot of good information. So this one was from someone who is a theistic evolutionist, someone who's a Christian but believes in evolution. And they pose the question, isn't it possible that since does it matter which is right? Did God really mean to teach real history in Genesis? That's the big, But anyway, he says, isn't it possible that since the ancient Israelites would not know about the universe beyond simple concepts, God simplified his description of the creation to a point where they could understand it? Well, Dr. Jonathan Sarfati answers, isn't it possible that's implying that ancient people were stupid is an example of what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery. He says God used simple language so that all people can understand, yet complicated enough to allow for constant scholarship. See,
Right.
I've heard this before. Well, you know, these people were simple. They wouldn't have really understood the complicated theory of evolution or physics or anything like this. But there's a difference here between using simplified language. For example, if you're talking to your child, right, and you say to them, well, you know, and they're asking, well, where do babies come from? And you say, well,
Right.
you know, the baby grew in mommy's tummy. Well, you're using simplified language. It's not a lie. I mean tummy, you know,
yeah.
you don't have to
Right.
get into uterus and then this kind
Right.
of thing. You're using simplified information. But if you said something, well, the stork brought the baby. Well, that's a lie.
That's an error.
That's an error.
Yeah.
It's not factual at all. There's no way you can relate that to reality. So, you know, when people say, well, God used the Big Bang, well, the Big Bang says that the sun came before the earth.
It's got a lot of things backwards.
Genesis
compared to
says that the earth was formed first and the sun was formed on day 4. So there's problems here. Further, why would God create a universe that seems to contradict his message if he wanted us to believe that Genesis creation story 100% literally? Well, this is incorrect the way even the question is posed. Why does it seem to contradict this? No, it only seems to contradict Genesis if you accept the secular interpretation of science.
Again,
by many.
It's facts versus interpretation. The same thing. I think we've touched that
Right.
probably on all the episodes that we're doing.
Well,
here.
it's the number one thing I hope to accomplish when I'm speaking at a church is to encourage people that there's different ways of explaining the evidence, right?
Yes.
And then it says, one of the other points, the fact that one chapter of one book of the Bible is dedicated to the entire creation of the universe, while 4 entire books are dedicated to the life of Jesus, shows us that we are shifting the focus of the good book by spending this much time on creation. Well, Dr. Sarfati pointed out, how many times does God need to say something before it's important?
Right.
He only told Adam once about not eating the forbidden fruit, and that's had the most catastrophic... Yeah.
Yes.
So, again, you know, of course the life of Jesus is important because he's here to redeem the problem that happened way back in Genesis, but you can't understand why Jesus needed to come if Genesis isn't literal history.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
anyway, some good points.
We've got another one here. If God can do anything, then can he make a being more powerful than himself? This is a new version of if God's all powerful, can he make a rock so heavy that he can't lift it?
This is a grade 1 philosophy class. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and this fellow writes in, or this lady writes in. Actually, my son in grade 8 asked me this question. She goes on to basically say that question. So here's the response that you can read on our website. One of our people responded to this. This is a variant of the old trick question. If God can do anything, can he make a rock too heavy for him to lift? Or can he make 2 + 2 = 5? Or make a circle, make a square a circle? Right? That's where we're going with this. The basic answer is, an all-powerful God can do or make anything, but it's meaningless to say that he can make or do a nothing. A logically contradictory state of affairs is not a thing at all, but a nothing. The point is, a rock too heavy for God to lift is really a rock too heavy for a being who could lift anything.
Right. There isn't such a thing.
There isn't such a thing.
God can't create something that
it's a
can't
nothing,
exist.
as Dr. Sarfati explains here.
Right.
It doesn't work. A square circle and 2 + 2 = 5 are likewise contradictory states of affairs.
Right.
And so it just goes on from there.
Mathematics has logical rules that dictate it. 2 + 2 cannot equal 5.
No matter how powerful you are. And he mentions that here as well. Note also, all-powerful surely means the power to do anything that power can do. If power can accomplish it, if you have all power. How much power would make a square circle or make any other self-contradictory things? A hydrogen bomb? A supernova? Of course not. No amount of power can make a square circle because that is not because it is not something any power can achieve.
Right.
And so it's these types of things that are answered in the Friday feedback section. That's why I like doing this on the program here.
Right.